Byzantine Emperor Justinian I's reconquest of Italy, liberating it from its brief stint under barbarian control, was even briefer. Soon after Justinian's forces regained control of portions of the peninsula, put them back under the empire's dominion, yet another Germanic group invaded and put most of Italy under their jurisdiction. The Lombards were a Scandinavian group who'd emerged as the dominant Germanic tribe. In 568, they conquered Byzantine Italy and formed what's called the Kingdom of Italy, which lasted into the late 8th century when it was brought down by the Franks, though Lombard nobles continued to rule portions of the peninsula until the 11th century. The Lombards conquered Italy during Gregory the Great's term as pope. As the Lombards advanced on the city of Rome, with not a whit of hope of help from the imperial rulers sitting in Ravenna, Gregory took control of Rome. He secured supplies for the coming siege, though both famine and plague had decimated the land. He bolstered Rome's defenses and commissioned new military leaders to lead an army into the field to meet the Lombards. And then once these plans were underway, Gregory opened negotiations with the enemy and finalized a peace with them without the emperor's approval. It's difficult for the modern student of history to understand how the Roman popes managed to wield such political power as they did during the Middle Ages. We tend to layer back onto history the current state of affairs, as Europe is now firmly ensconced in a secularism that's antagonistic to the church. It's difficult to see how a pope could have been the single most powerful political force for hundreds of years. While the influence of the Pope had grown ever since the days of Leo the Great, it was under Gregory the Great that the Pope became, a defining role in the history of Europe. Though Gregory was in his senior years and increasingly frail, what he accomplished was breathtaking. At the same time that he dealt with the Lombards and the daily needs of the city, he administered the church. He oversaw its estates, cared for the needs of his huge flock, provided leaders for the churches of both Gaul and Spain, dealt with the ever-present challenge of the church at Constantinople, which was vying with Rome for preeminence. And on top of all of that, as we've seen, he planned for the expansion of the faith into new realms. In Europe, Gregory's papacy marks the transition from the ancient world where imperial Rome ruled to the medieval world united by the Roman Catholic Church. The church played a major role in that world. It was the one institution that survived and transmitted Roman culture into the Middle Ages. Though altered to fit its unique spiritual emphasis, the Roman Church drew its organizational and administrative structure from the old imperial form. Each city had its own bishop, and each region had its archbishop, and then within each bishop's realm of oversight, called a diocese, which was a Roman term, there was a staff of assistants that closely resembled Roman civil administration. Church rules were called canon law, and they were parallel to Roman civil law. Now, at first, canon law was defined by church councils that met to decide both practical and doctrinal issues. Eventually, canon law came to include decisions of the Pope as a kind of imperial edict. Latin became the common tongue, and Roman forms of literature and education spread wherever the church took hold. Whenever a new church was built, its form was that of the old Roman meeting hall, a basilica. As we saw at the end of the previous episode, though the Germanic barbarians conquered the Western Empire, it wasn't long until the church conquered them. While most of the Germanic tribes were Arian in their belief, when they moved south into areas controlled by the Roman Church, they usually converted to the Nicene Catholic Christianity. The Lombards were the last of the Germanic tribes to invade Italy. Part of Pope Gregory's strategy in negotiating with them was to convert them, turning them into brothers in Christ. They too began as Arians, but he supported the Lombard queen Theodelinda, a Nicene, and it didn't take long before the Lombards were firmly planted in the Catholic faith. Gregory appealed to other Germanic leaders in Western Europe, and they shed their Arianism as well. The Visigoths of Spain became Nicene when Gregory's letter reached their leader Recared. There was only one Germanic tribe to enter the empire as pagans rather than as Arians. That was the Franks. They occupied an area near the Rhine River. When their king died in 481, he was succeeded by his 15-year-old son, Clovis. 5 years later, Clovis led his warriors southwest against the other Frank tribes. He extended his rule all the way to the Seine. Throughout this time, he worshipped and gave credit to the ancient Frankish gods. Clovis's victories moved the rulers of neighboring tribes to attempt negotiations. Now, one of Clovis's envoys returned from a trip to the court of Burgundy, describing the beautiful granddaughter named Clotilda of the Burgundian king. Now, Clovis sent another envoy asking for Clotilda's hand in marriage. The Burgundians were worried what Clovis would do if they balked, and so, they consented, and the two were wed. Clotilda was a genuine believer in Jesus, and she shared her faith with her husband, but he remained committed to the old gods for the next 3 years. He thought his distrust in the Christian God was warranted. After all, hadn't the Roman Empire converted to the new faith just a century before it fell? Why hadn't he protected them from the barbarians? It was the same question that you may remember both Augustine and Salvian had dealt with in their writings. Then a more personal trial struck Clovis. Clotilda baptized their firstborn son, and he died a week later. Infant mortality was quite high in those days, so while Clotilda's faith was unshaken, Clovis was enraged. Despite his suspicions, Clovis allowed Clotilda to have their second child baptized. And when this son also sickened, Clovis was furious. But the boy recovered at Clotilda's urgent requests to Christ. With all of this freshly behind him, Clovis went out to meet what was the Franks' biggest challenge to date, the fierce Germanic tribe called the Alemanni. The battle took place near the city of Bonn. With the Franks close to defeat, Clovis called upon his old gods, but no help came. So, in desperation, staring the end in the face, Clovis decided that he would cry out to the Christian God, saying something along the lines of, "Jesus, if you're really the Son of God, as my wife tells me, grant me victory and I'll believe in you." Now, certainly a dubious request, and God doesn't bargain with humans, but the Alemanni experienced a dramatic, may we say miraculous reversal, and the Franks were victorious. That day in 496 turned out to be a dramatic turning point for the history of Europe, because Clovis was good to his promise. He invited Bishop Remigius of Reims to instruct him in the faith. He was baptized on Christmas Day. Now, Remigius continued to instruct Clovis in the faith, but the king was unable to grasp the heart of the gospel. When Remigius told him the story of how Jesus was arrested, tortured, and executed, Clovis jumped up and shouted, "If I'd been there with my Franks, I would have avenged him." A few thousand of his warriors soon followed their king in baptism. And one anecdotal story that comes from this time was that there were so many troops wanting to be baptized that they had to do mass baptisms at a river. A dozen of them would enter the water at a time, and as a priest stood on the shore and blessed them, they would lower themselves under the surface of the water, but holding their right hands above their heads so they never went under the water. And when the priest asked, "Why are you doing that?" the warriors explained that they didn't want to baptize their sword hand. They wanted to continue to make war and didn't want to submit the hand that held the sword to the rule of Christ. Now, to be clear, this story, while attributed to Clovis's troops, it's also assigned to other periods of history, especially the Crusaders. And whether it's true or not, that's in dispute. But what this story illustrates is an important feature of medieval society. Adoption of Christianity was, in essence, a royal policy. The ruler's religion decided the religion of his subjects, and queens did much to bring about the conversion of their husbands. Clovis was one of the first of the line of French kings known as the Merovingians. His conversion paved the way for an important alliance between the papacy and the Franks. But it took decades before that alliance altered the way the Franks treated the church. Throughout most of the 6th and 7th centuries, the Merovingian court appointed their own bishops to the churches of Gaul. At the end of the 6th century, Pope Gregory began to work with them to alter this, but it wasn't really until the 8th century that Rome was able to regain control over church appointments. After Gregory, the West entered a difficult period, as we've chronicled in the episode titled The Great Recession. The Western Church suffered abuse from both Lombard and Byzantine rulers. In Gaul, the Merovingians treated the church as a political tool, and the quality of church leaders declined dramatically as church offices were sold to the highest bidder. Until this period, the clergy were men of great learning and intellectual skill. A list of the great thinkers of the 1st through 6th centuries was dominated by monks and priests. But the political corruption that followed hard on the heels of the demise of the Western Empire, well, it led to a decline in the intellectual prowess of the clergy. That decline was slow at first, but it escalated as the decades passed. That's what happened when church offices are filled by political appointments paying favors rather than gifted and called servants of God. Bishop Gregory of Tours lived in the late 6th century and is the main source of information about the Merovingian court. He describes the sorry state European society had fallen to. It was a period when women stood almost alone in maintaining what was left of morality and virtue. Monasteries and converts became lonely islands of true religion, set in a sea of moral debauchery and spiritual corruption that included not a few churches. This state of affairs continued all the way to the 8th century, when revival took root at the instigation of Celtic missionaries from Ireland. Other factors that led to this revival were a renewed papacy and a new Frank dynasty. Celtic missionaries had been at work in Europe since the last half of the 6th century, and most notable of these was a man by the name of Columba. He was born to a noble family in Donegal, Ireland. After schooling, he was ordained a priest and planted churches and monasteries in Ireland. Then, in 563, Columba left his homeland. Why he left is a mystery, but it seems that it was a kind of, self-imposed exile. Columba helped spark a civil war between his and the king's clan. As penance, he left, setting himself to go wherever the winds blew. He was accompanied by a dozen friends. They ended up landing on the tiny island of Iona on the west coast of Scotland, where, against all expectations, they established a thriving monastery. Many an observer would assume that Columba and his companions would have died within a year due to the harsh conditions there. But on the contrary, while life was tough, they thrived. And the monastery became the focal point for a new movement of God that would reach out to thousands of miles. Missionaries were soon being sent out to found monasteries along the coast of Scotland, back in Ireland, and along the northern coast of Europe from Gaul all the way to Scandinavia. Taking a page from St. Patrick's playbook, Columba was kind of warlike in the way that he went about spreading the faith. At his preaching, King Brude of the Picts was converted. Columba's spiritually aggressive posture was necessary because he was dealing with a determined and overtly evil enemy in the form of the Druids, who only understood force. A weak and timid brand of the faith would only have provoked them to acts of hideous grotesquerie. Columba's blend of mystic spirituality coupled to a tough-minded application of faith in a political and social context, all shaped by a commitment to scholarship and a love of nature, marked him as that rare individual who was the right man at the right time doing the right thing for the right reason. He's the prototypical example of Celtic Christianity. Columba was the mold that Celtic Christian missionaries were cut from as they sailed across the sea to land in Gaul, carrying the sparks of revival that united to bring Europe out of the Great Recession.